All right. I am now joined by my wife, Jennifer, who is also a philosophy professor. And
not Ben's sister. I see somebody asked. I'm not Ben's sister.
Yeah, that'd be really messed up. So the idea of these, we've been doing the Wednesday movie live streams with various people like Micah Utrecht, deputy editor of Jacobin, and our good friend Ryan Lake to talk about movies on Wednesdays. On Sundays, we have been doing the Sunday night debate breakdowns. The one coming up this Sunday, by the way, is the debate about Herbert Marcuse with Matt Taibbi and Esco. And then thought it would be fun. I've been trying to, to figure out ways to work in more, straight philosophy content to the channel. And Jen is by far the best classroom teacher that I know. So she, figured she
no offense, Ryan.
she wouldn't want to come on for the, for the political stuff. But she would be happy to come on to talk about philosophy. So that is what we are going to do today.
It is.
So we thought that for this first one, we'd talk about utilitarianism, which is so. I mean, I guess one way to set that up would be anybody who watched the debate I did with Douglas Wilson on Monday. That was about divine command ethics, the idea that what's morally right is what God wants, what's morally wrong is whatever God doesn't want. And one of Wilson's arguments is that if you don't have this as the foundation, then you can't make sense of the idea of things being morally right or morally wrong objectively, as opposed to just being a preference or something like that. And one of the alternative theories to divine command ethics, which is in some ways one of the easier ones to understand, I think, is utilitarianism.
I think it's definitely the easiest one to understand. Right. Out of all of them.
Okay. Yeah. And then the other.
No politics. Yeah. 255 AD. This is not political. Cut that out.
So she will not be drawn into it. The political discussion. Look, I'll say that she let me put a Bernie sticker on our car. I
was very happy. To have that. Yes. And the sign in our yard.
Yeah. Which is looking,
very bedraggled.
Yeah, sort of like the state of the larger movement it represents. It's it's buried in snow right now. But here today to talk about philosophy. So yeah, I mean, certainly compared to something like Kantianism, utilitarianism is very straightforward. On Kantianism, by the way, the episode for patrons next Thursday is going to be a beginner's guide to Kant with Matt McManus and Russ Sabriglia and the aforementioned Ryan Lake. So maybe we could set that up at the very end of this. But right now, let's talk about utilitarianism. So what's that?
Bringing about the greatest utility.
Yeah.
See there, that's all we need to say.
All right.
Easy to understand, isn't it?
Stream over.
So we're done here.
So I think one way of thinking about utilitarianism is that it's a combination of a couple of simpler ideas, or at least in, let's say, utilitarianism classic, right? It's like there's New Coke, Coke classic. It's very old reference. Anyway.
He's so old.
So utilitarianism, utilitarianism classic, your sort of basic utilitarianism 1.0 is a combination of three things. One of them, the first two are consequentialism and hedonism. You want to take it from there, unpack those a little bit?
Consequentialism, that's about consequences. That's what the theory looks at. It looks at consequences. What is going to happen if I take choice A? What is going to happen if I take choice B? And hedonism is just pleasure. You love pleasure. That's all you want. That's all that matters. Pleasure.
Yeah. So a consequentialist theory of morality says that the right thing to do is the thing that maximizes, that has good consequences.
And what does that mean?
That so whether something's good or bad morally is a matter of whether it leads to good consequences or bad consequences. But then you have to say, well, what makes a consequence good? What makes
That's what I was asking.
Okay, that's what you're.
Yeah,
that's what you
that's
okay.
okay.
All right. There are different ways maybe that you can answer that, but certainly the way classical utilitarianism answers it is it says that consequences are good insofar as, and this is where we come back to hedonism, that that they bring about pleasure, or well-being or something like that, and
happiness, and
then they minimize suffering. So
unhappiness.
So hedonism is so if you think, if you ever watched Futurama, which is at least more recent than New Coke, then
I do know Futurama.
Okay, so in Futurama, there's a character named Hedonism Bot, who is this robot who is carried around on a litter, eating grapes and talking about orgies and things like that. So that's that's what people tend to think of when they think of hedonism. But philosophical hedonism is a philosophical position, is not necessarily that you should just wildly and recklessly, pursue pleasure. It's that pleasure is the only thing that's good in itself. So do you want to take it from there, like what that distinction is in itself?
I kind of lost the thread.
Okay,
all right,
all right, fair enough. This was probably way too complicated, but anyway. So there are lots of things, because if you hear the hedonists say only pleasure is good, you might reasonably think, hold on, lots of things are good.
But why are they good?
Right. So if we list off all the good things, friendship is good, democracy is good, whatever, then
schnauzers are good.
Schnauzers are good. Schnauzers are very good. So then the hedonist response will be, okay, those things are good, but they're not good in themselves. They're good because they lead to happiness. And there is something very intuitive about this, because if you think about how you would explain to someone that like friendship is good or democracy is good or whatever you pick as your good thing,
makes you happy.
That they have say, well, why is friendship good? Well, imagine life without friendship, how miserable that would be. Why is it good to live in a society with human rights protections? Well, imagine like all the horrible things you could be subjected to without it, and ultimately, you're what's going to be described as some sort of vision of horrible suffering. Imagine
a life with no schnauzers.
Right, same deal. So so there's consequentialism, there's hedonism, and then the last part of classical utilitarianism is the idea that, like, what we could maybe call impartialism, like everybody counts the same. So it's not that. So you could be like I think Ayn Rand's view that like selfishness is good is technically a form of consequentialism, because it's about consequences, but it's about consequences for you. Utilitarianism is about consequences for everybody who's impacted by your actions. So it's not about making you happy necessarily if there are other people who are impacted by what
everyone counts as one. No one counts as more than one,
right?
Including yourself.
Right. So utilitarianism might actually often recommend
doing what's best for you.
Right, but it might also recommend self-sacrifice because it could be that serves the greater good. I guess now I'm trying to think whether the Star Trek movie where Spock talks about the needs of the many or the needs of the few is before or after New Coke.
So you're old and a dork.
Yes, that would be the lesson here. I mean, I actually literally have no idea what year New Coke is, but it's something I'm vaguely aware existed. But in any case, so
And it sucked.
right, which is why they
That's
brought
what
back,
I hear.
brought back Coke Classic is the idea. So, and I guess the one thing before getting into like the more interesting issues about utilitarianism maybe is that some people hear talk about greater good, or or good for everybody who's affected, and they think, or like if you think about like the trolley problem, which we won't talk about this time, we'll do one about that at some point. You might think, okay, so are you talking about like taking a poll? Do you just count the people who something benefits or doesn't benefit, or what?
Yeah, like action A is going to benefit 10 people, action B is going to benefit 5 people. So obviously we should do action A because 10 is more than 5.
All right. Is that what the utilitarian actually says?
No. No, it is not.
Yeah. So utilitarians don't say that because what matters is maximizing happiness, not maximizing the number of people who are happy.
Now, you may have heard the greatest good for the greatest number, and that's misleading.
Yeah. So the reason it's misleading is that the emphasis is really on the greater good. It might be in lots of situations, maybe most situations. What's good for the most people is also the thing that brings about the greatest good, understood in terms of maximal happiness, well-being, flourish, whatever, right, and minimal suffering, but not always, not necessarily.
Yeah, those things usually do fit together, but they don't have to fit together. And when the greatest number conflicts with the greatest good, then we go with the greatest good.
Yeah. So, and this helps get around some of the immediate objections that some people think of when they think about utilitarianism. Like when you first hear it, you might just think, oh, this is just obviously ridiculous. This is silly, because if you're thinking we're just counting people, then it's super easy to come up with completely crazy consequences of utilitarianism. That if you have a gang of like 10 teenagers, like
a gang,
like in A Clockwork Orange,
a gang,
yes, a gang, right? And they beat up like one old man who's living on the street, just out of boredom. You might think, aha, utilitarians would say that's okay because
10 is more than 1,
right? Yeah, there we go.
So when you commit a crime, make sure you take along a lot of people so you can outnumber the victims.
Right. Utilitarians would not actually recommend that strategy, and they might. Well, they wouldn't, because the reason is that just because more people benefit from something than suffer from it, that doesn't mean that it leads to more happiness than suffering.
Right, but they might still recommend that, not for that reason, but they might still recommend that.
Oh, just like in terms of...
If you had enough people going along with you to commit the crime.
Sure, you'll probably do a better job of crime, if you have lots of people to help you.
That's not even what I was saying.
What were you saying?
The happiness of all the depraved criminals could add up to more. The more criminals you get involved,
the better chance you have. Mm-hmm. But in a case like the one we just gave, presumably that's like one evening's entertainment for those the 10.
One would hope.
The 10 kids of the gang, whereas the old man, maybe he dies and then he loses like however many years of potential happiness he had left.
What if his life sucked?
If it, well, your life has to suck a whole lot for it to be.
And some people's lives do suck a whole lot.
Okay, but you can't just assume that any
this is what it's like in our house.
Any random guy that it's not.
No, it really is.
Any random guy you meet on the street that who looks kind of sad to you can't assume his life is so bad that literally it's more bad than good that he remains alive.
No, of course you don't just assume that. You would have to do some investigating.
Yeah, and there was a good question in the chat about benefit. Right, so the question isn't what you want necessarily, at least for utilitarianism classic. It's what would be good for you, understood in terms of more happiness, less suffering. So, which lots of times people are wrong about that, but that doesn't matter, right, for the classical utilitarian. So, if, the old man having his life cut off sooner, or maybe he has to go to, through like lots of pain and physical therapy and whatever.
No, just death.
And either way, it's bad, right? And either way,
it depends though.
Either way, it's probably more bad than an evening's entertainment times 10.
It's badder.
Badder? Is that the?
No.
Okay.
So, I just wanted to get you to see it.
Okay. Yes, it's much badder. And so it's not like, even if you ultimately come to the conclusion that utilitarianism really is, badder than Kantianism or virtue theory or whatever other moral theory, it's not quite as easy to knock it down as that. You can't just say, hey, what about the,
Ooh, there's a good question right there.
Which one?
Does potential happiness count?
Yeah, I think it has to. Like for this to work at all, I think potential happiness has to count, because you're interested in comparing the hypotheticals. If I do this, how much happiness or suffering is going to come about? If I do that, how much happiness or suffering is going about? So you can compare the two.
But the thing is, how far in advance are you supposed to go? How far ahead do you need to look?
Good question.
Good question.
I do not have a good answer on
Neither
the
do I.
utilitarian's behalf.
Neither do I. That's one thing that makes this a troublesome theory, is there's really no, when is the cutoff?
Right.
Do I look 20 years ahead and then that's the cutoff? Do I need to worry about my future children, my future grandchildren?
Yeah, and some people I think especially when they're starting to try to figure this out, they think, well, this just means utilitarianism, like that you can't even get good advice out of it. And I see you making a good point in the chat, Oliver. We will get back to that.
Hang on, let me look for Oliver.
There we go.
Yeah.
So that you can't.
That's what I'm saying, Oliver.
There's the utilitarian will just have no idea what's right or wrong, because consequences, the further you go out, are really hard to predict. But I guess I don't think that. I mean, I wouldn't really conclude too much from that.
Common sense, bruh. Just common sense.
Because it seems like commonsensically we do manage all the time. Like, whether or not you think that consequences are what morality is about, we certainly think it's about what prudential rationality is about. We're
not paralyzed because we don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, that if you could that. When you're just making decisions, try to maximize benefit in your own life, you don't just have, okay, hey, it's possible that if I just do meth all the time, that in some butterfly effect way that'll lead to better consequences than if I go to law school or whatever. That's not.
Don't do meth. It's going to destroy our marriage.
Okay. Well, I won't do that or go to law school. How about that? But
that would probably also destroy our marriage. I don't want to be married to a lawyer. Philosopher's bad enough.
Yeah. No, totally. I mean, in terms of the hierarchy of wretchedness of the professional classes, the lawyer is definitely worse. So, the point, the point is just that if you think that it's possible to make rational decisions about your own life based on what you think the likely consequences are going to be in a reasonable time frame, it doesn't necessarily seem crazy to think that you could make rational decisions about what, as far as you can tell, as far as you can see out, will most likely lead to better consequences for everybody involved. And there are lots of contexts in which, even if you end up not being a utilitarian, even if you reject pure utilitarianism, there are probably lots of contexts that you think that's what we like, that's what's morally right anyway. I think there are lots of, there are lots of cases in which presumably, even if you're not a consequentialist, even if you don't think that consequences are like the one thing that morality is about, that doesn't mean you don't care about consequences when you're making moral decisions, and you're still able to do some reasoning about it. We can't have perfect information, but that doesn't mean, that we just have no idea what to do. So, so you want to do the Bentham thing?
What Bentham thing
Okay.
about the mummified head?
Yeah. So
That's one Bentham thing.
So the guy in the thumbnail for the stream is Jeremy Bentham, who is kind of the founding.
What do you mean, the mummified or the normal?
I think the normal is the one that ended up in the
Yeah,
thumbnail.
but isn't that Mill?
Oh,
didn't we go with Mill?
Okay, I thought it was still Bentham.
Andrew, what do we do?
Okay, well anyway, one of those guys is in there. Bentham.
No. Remember Mill's head? Andrew said Mill's head looked like it had big bugs underneath the skin.
Yeah.
So I don't think he really wanted to go with that.
Yeah. So we went with Bentham, who's kind of the founder of modern utilitarianism. It has its roots in much older philosophies, Epicureanism, whatever. But modern utilitarianism really starts with Bentham, 19th century, kind of turn of the 18th to the 19th century England. And Bentham, the guy we didn't go with because our graphic designer Andy thought his skull shape looked weird.
Big bugs underneath it.
Yeah. So insert your own phrenology joke here.
Which he messaged to us right before bed. So that was wonderful. Thanks.
Yeah. Although that fact is not nearly as horrifying as the original picture of Bentham we're going to go with, which is right here. So fun fact about Jeremy Bentham, he had after he died, this is the original thumbnail with the picture of Bentham's head as it looks right now. So after he died, he had his head mummified.
No, he had his whole body.
Okay.
They
you know more about this than I do.
Like when you die and your skin and everything kind of rots away. So they took his clothes and they surrounded his skeleton with like hay and stuff, and they put his clothes back on him. And they put him, where did they put him? Some college in London.
I think it's the London School of Economics.
Okay.
I want to say that, yeah.
Okay.
I'm not going to subject people to that image for any longer. That was enough seconds of looking at Bentham's mummified head. But
well, and the head, it didn't last so well. So they took some of his hair, his actual hair, and they put it on a wax head that they could put on his, an icon.
Yeah.
Is what, he said. And so they took the mummified head off of the body and they put it down between his feet. But the students kept stealing it to do pranks with it. So it's locked away now. Bentham still sometimes attends committee meetings. The students will, get him out of his case and roll him down the hallway, and he's listed as present but not voting.
Yeah. Yep. So yeah, I vetoed that for the thumbnail. I didn't want to horrify anybody before they even tuned in to watch this.
Well, Andrew suggested that we have a different mummified body part for everyone, and Ben vetoed that. I don't know why.
Fun idea, but I was going to stick in the mud about that too. So yeah, that's Bentham. But the person which actually I wonder if that did help inspire the Futurama thing with the people from the 20th century with the heads in jars from in the year 3000. But anyway, the philosopher people are most likely to think of when they think about old utilitarian philosophers is Jon Stewart Mill, the man with the apparently who Andy thinks has a weirdly shaped skull. And Mill is actually Bentham's godson. Fun fact, that Bentham's Mill's godfather, and Mill is Bertrand Russell's godfather. So
we got all the info.
Yeah, so weird little chain of philosophically important.
Dude, they all weird. Sorry.
Fair enough.
They all weird.
So anyway, yep. So a little trivia about that little chain of atheist godfathers, but but in any case, so I guess one way to do this is before thinking about possible objections to utilitarianism, I was thinking it might be worth like taking a beat to think about why this might be an appealing view.
Well, can I
Sure.
just interject here from one of the comments? You can look at utilitarianism one of two ways. And like we were talking about, you can't always predict what's going to happen, but some people look at the expected results and some people look at the actual results. So if you're that robber that goes in and robs the family and ends up saving them all from a gas leak, well, if what you were concerned with was actual results, then yeah, you did the right thing. But there's not a lot of that, because too much of that depends on luck.
Yeah.
And expected consequences depends more on common sense.
Yeah. So my friend Neil Sinababu is a utilitarian moral philosopher, teaches at the National University of Singapore, and he
went to Singapore without me.
Yeah.
I just want to throw that in.
Well, I mean, the first time we weren't even dating yet, so
it doesn't matter.
I kind of think that gets me off the hook for that. But anyway, so anyway, Neil has this view that actual consequences are what matters for what's morally right or morally wrong, but like intended, foreseen consequences are what matters for like the moral worth of your action. And he has all these fun examples to justify that, like if you imagine a cannibal who just goes around killing and eating people at random, and one of the people that he ate, was like young Adolf Hitler, and so so eating Hitler prevented unfathomable millions of deaths, but presumably we don't think that the cannibal should get moral credit for it. Or conversely, if you're going to like volunteering to help people in some distant country, and you have the best possible intentions in terms of the consequences of your actions, but you unwittingly spread a fatal disease there,
that's
then
bad.
Yeah, that is very bad, but it also doesn't, it doesn't seem like
it should affect the moral worth of what you were doing.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think that one thing that makes utilitarianism attractive is
let's all go to Singapore.
Maybe not right now.
Right, not now. No.
Probably Singapore doesn't even allow Americans to visit right now.
I imagine not.
COVID.
Why would they?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure Canada still doesn't allow Americans to visit, so I don't think Singapore does right now. But
Andrew, he didn't take me to Iceland either. And you were what, 0 when you went to Iceland? Yeah, he didn't take me either. So yeah, I feel you.
Anyway, so the point. The point just. Okay, so the point I was trying to get to before I was being heckled about Singapore was that there is something, like, before thinking about criticisms of it, there is something very attractive about utilitarianism, or certainly at least attractive, to me. I'd imagine to a lot of the people probably watch this, because I mean, one thing is that I think makes it attractive to almost anybody is that it does capture something important about what I think we intuitively think morality is all about. We think that it's about helping people and not hurting them and saving them from being hurt where possible and all that stuff. And I think in particular, if you have some basic, like socially progressive views that both anybody who's not like a sort of hardcore social conservative is likely to have, then it might also capture part of what motivates that, like the idea that it doesn't really make sense to say that something is immoral if it doesn't hurt anybody. That like a lot of times when you hear somebody say, oh, it's morally wrong, being gay is morally wrong, or things like that. If those sorts of views, it's if you sort of instinctively reject that it seems like a big part of why you reject it is that you think that there's some link between what's morally wrong and what hurts anybody. If there's no victim, then you might think that's a reason not to think that it's morally wrong. And you could apply the same reasoning to a lot of different issues. So that there's something very very appealing about that instead of making morality about whether something happens to fit with like whatever idea, like social conventions, whatever idea your culture just sort of happens to have ended up with historically, or what some religious text says or something like that, it's about helping people and not hurting people. And there's something really basically appealing about that.
Having a good life.
Yeah.
Helping the people around you to have a good life, having an overall state of good lifeness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's also something that, again, in context where we're thinking it's very natural, I think, also to think into these terms when you're talking about contexts where we're trying to decide things that impact huge numbers of people. So friend Jeremy Salmon, who is a host of the Giving the Mic to the Wrong Person podcast, asked in the chat about the connection between utilitarianism and means testing. And without going off on a whole political thing here, I think that there is, like, just thinking about how we would even answer that question. Is it good to have government programs that only apply to certain people, that you say, if you don't really need it, you don't get it, you only get it up until a certain income threshold or something? Or is it better to have government programs that everybody can get, that's just like a right of being part of that society, that everybody can get it, like healthcare in Canada? And whatever you think about that issue, I think it's very natural to argue about it in utilitarian terms, to say, well, this is a good consequence of having it be this way. This is a bad consequence of having it be that way. And so, like, a lot of the, maybe you think that there's some point of principle here. Some people absolutely do. But thank you. Thank you for the super chat. Whoever will or won't drink it, that is much appreciated. So it's very natural to think of those terms. Like, you have that if you're thinking about reasons why it might be good not to have an income cutoff, then you might start thinking about stuff like, okay, if only some people benefit from it, then people who don't think they benefit from it might support cutting it because they don't think they're ever going to get something out of it. So it might be a better strategy to keep it for everybody to not have a cutoff. Or
this is sounding like it's kind of veering.
It is. I'm just trying to answer Jeremy's question.
Thanks a lot, Jeremy.
Yeah. Yeah. So exactly. So that's the. So all of that, I think, makes utilitarianism seem very reasonable and very attractive. Or, I mean, like, one more in the same vein, also teetering on the edge of the political, that I mentioned real quickly, is if you.
I also vote for watching the video of shiny, happy people twice a day.
Yeah. So that if, like, the idea that, like, we want a criminal justice system that's not about just punishing people because they deserve to be punished, but it's about, rehabilitation and things like that, is something that, again, is a sort of, you don't have to be a utilitarian to think any of these things, but if you do think these things, utilitarianism might seem like a natural sort of way of explaining why. So that all sounds good. So what, if anything, is wrong with it?
Well, actually, you know what? I'm going to open the window.
Sure,
I am dying. Here, take the dog.
Okay. Sure. So certainly one thing that's wrong with it gets down to something that Oliver was pointing out in the chat earlier, which is that quick explanation they gave earlier about why, okay, utilitarianism doesn't have these totally crazy consequences that it might seem to have, relies on the math working out the right way. Which
we cannot make different mummified body parts the theme of the show now.
Okay. So if it's 10 people, if it's 10 people in the gang and there's one victim, you might think, okay, an evening's entertainment times 10 isn't going to counterbalance this like terrible amount of suffering that's being inflicted. And even if you're thinking about like the Roman Colosseum, where gladiators are, being forced to fight to the death for people's amusement. And okay, Colosseum can fit a lot of people, but it still seems plausible that, you run the numbers, you sort of pretend that we can quantify happiness, which no utilitarian philosopher is silly enough to think that we can actually do that, right? Like that human psychology is really that simple, that we can do like 1 unit of happiness, half a unit of suffering or whatever. But
yeah, I tell my students, suppose this gives you 10 utiles worth of happiness. And they're like, what? What does that mean? Like, just go with me.
Yeah.
And a lot of philosophy, you gotta just go with me.
So
and her name's Lucy. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
How can you not know Lucy by now? Everybody knows Lucy by now.
So pretend that you could quantify happiness, that we could say, here's an exact quantity of happiness, 10 utiles, 5 anti-utiles, units of suffering. If a utile is a unit of happiness, which obviously we can't, nobody thinks we can, but it helps clarify the structure of the view to pretend that we can. So, okay, so maybe if we add up all the utiles from all of the spectators in the Roman Colosseum and balance them against the suffering and lost happiness from the gladiators fighting to the death, for their amusement, the gladiators still win, and it's still wrong to make them fight. That's kind of plausible, but that's also contingent, that it just happens. If it's true, it's because it just happens to be true. That it's not necessarily true. We could imagine, especially if you think like, some higher tech version of the Colosseum, the Hunger Games or something. And we imagine some huge society where there are like 10 million people, watching the Hunger Games on TV.
And look at all the people that watch the movie.
There you go. It's, not even a great movie. So
wait, did you see the movie?
Oh, yes.
I didn't see the movie.
Yes.
I didn't see any of the movies. We listened to the books on audiobook. What were we doing? We were doing some big long drive.
Like driving cross country for some reason.
And we listened to the audiobooks.
Yeah.
Is that dolors? Is that really the technical term, or is that something that you made up? Because I get that from Spanish, but I was just wondering if that was an accepted term, or you just thought it up.
Certainly not something
I like it. But no, I haven't heard that either.
Yeah. So in that case, it seems like the math wouldn't work out the utilitarian's way, that you'd have that there would be more happiness than suffering brought into the world, a lot more maybe, by having the Hunger Games with this like mass enjoyment of it, than not. But it still seems just obviously and extremely morally wrong and unjust. Or Derek Parfit, who is somebody who, fun fact, that he was a professor. He died a couple of years ago. He was a professor at, I think, Oxford part of the year and Rutgers part of the year. And he, even though I really like a lot of his work, I never, we were adjuncts. We were both adjuncts at Rutgers for a few years. And I never,
Rutgers peeps.
I never,
miss y'all.
I never met him while we were there, even though there was a good friend of mine who was one of his housemates. But Derek Parfit has this example. He calls it the repugnant conclusion, which is, you imagine like some society that like Soylent Green style has such a huge population relative to really scarce resources that everybody's living a life that's just barely worth living. Like the happiness just barely edges out the suffering, because there's so little to go around in the society. And he says the utilitarian, look, you can make the math work out so that there's more happiness to suffering in that society than in the one that we live in right now. But it still seems crazy to think that would be morally better. And you can go through a lot of these things. So there are all these classic examples, like somebody is, a tourist in a remote country, and the army is about to kill like 10 people in a village, and they say that as a special favor, because you're an honored visitor,
As a special favor, they'll let you kill somebody.
Yeah, they'll let you kill one of them yourself.
And if you do that, they'll let everybody else go free.
Yeah. And so if you think that that would still be bad, right? Even though you're clearly
Infinity War.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. Even though you're clearly leading to less suffering, by doing that, because that guy would have been killed anyway, whatever, then that's some reason to think that that morality isn't just a matter of calculating good and bad consequences, that there are some things that are just wrong in principle to do.
But for the utilitarian, there is nothing that's just wrong in principle, other than not maximizing happiness. I mean, that's wrong in principle, but there's no action that's ever going to be wrong in principle.
Yeah.
My students have a hard time getting that. I say, well, according to the utilitarian, this is wrong, or this is how things end up, and they'll be like, but that's wrong. Like, no, you're going into this with this already created idea of what's right and what's wrong. This is how we're figuring out what's right and what's wrong. So once, if you're going to be with this theory, you can't be like, oh, well, I don't like that conclusion because it's wrong. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I saw somebody in the chat ask a question about why Zizek has suggested that happiness is a terrible positive metric, and that's a little bit sideways to what we're talking about. But Zizek's
is this political?
No, not really. It's psychology.
Okay,
so
I'm cool with that.
So Zizek's point, and this has to do with like Lacanian psychology, is that if you're basically if your goal is happiness because the objects of desire are never really attained, and you're basically, that's not going to work out well for you if you're just trying to be happy. But unless I'm really misunderstanding his point about this, which is possible, I do not know a ton about Lacanian psychology, or pretend to. But if I'm understanding his point, then I think that's like a slightly separate question, because that's more like what's actually going to make you happy. And I think you could agree with the utilitarian that the only thing that's ultimately good is happiness, but it could just be some weird psychological fact about us that if we're trying to achieve happiness, it's not going to work, which is sometimes actually something people bring up. I don't know if it's exactly an objection to utilitarianism, but it could be that like everybody being a utilitarian won't be what leads to the most happiness, that it could be that everybody being a Kantian or something is actually going to work out to a world where there's the more happiness and less suffering. Yeah, right. That's the galaxy brain stage of the meme. But even if that's true, I
thought you were too old to know about memes.
Yeah, I saw one about New Coke once, and I understood how it worked. All right, great. I will have to add delay on sometimes to talk about that. But even if that's true, like the utilitarian could still be right. It would just be like a really weird thing that was also true, I think. So there are some examples that might motivate you to think, okay, maybe the utilitarian is wrong to say that nothing is wrong in principle, that things are only right or wrong insofar as they lead to good or bad consequences. And you can come up with all these examples that seem to show that some things can be lead to good consequences but still be wrong, or vice versa. They lead to bad consequences but they're still right. And if the the surgeon in the hospital could cut somebody up, and like they could just get some formaldehyde and knock out a healthy patient and then transplant his organs to a few people who all need them. And that, would lead to more people living than otherwise, but it still seems really wrong. And that's the kind of example that might motivate you to think, oh, maybe utilitarianism is the wrong moral theory after all. Maybe there are some things that are right even though they don't lead to better consequences. They're wrong even if they don't lead to worse consequences.
And the utilitarian says, yeah, sure, there are justice. That's a good thing to have, because if we lived in a just world, then that would maximize happiness. But sometimes justice has just got to go out the window for whatever.
Yeah. So
and if we did substitute well-being for happiness, the difference there is that happiness is your own subjective experience, whereas well-being is more of an objective. It might not make you happy, but it's going to bring about your well-being. So that's gonna make things a little different.
Yeah. Or
although happiness, we are supposed to consider that in the long term, which is why people go to grad school and be miserable for years, so that then they can end up like us. Maybe this isn't the best example.
Yeah, probably.
But short-term suffering for long-term gain. You aren't supposed to just think about the moment. So maybe those would end up being closer than I originally thought.
Yeah. So one way that the utilitarian can get around at least some of this wouldn't work for all of these objections, but at least some of them, one strategy that some utilitarians try to do to get around it is by saying, okay, well, this would be a problem for act utilitarianism, but we can get around it by being rule utilitarians instead. So what's the difference between those?
I'm sorry, between what?
Act and rule utilitarianism.
Sorry, I was
reading the chat.
Yeah.
David Feldman is always yelling at me about that when I'm on his show. That
but this is your deal.
I'm getting distracted by reading the chat.
But if I'm distracted, it's okay.
Okay.
I was distracted by somebody wanting Sam Harris to tell them what well-being was.
Yeah, don't hold your back.
You should look into Aristotle. That would be a lot more.
Yeah.
Informative.
Yeah. So
the difference.
Hot take: Aristotle better than Sam Harris.
Check. Let me write that down.
Okay.
The difference between rule and act utilitarianism. Act is the classic utilitarianism, what Mill was advocating, where you evaluate each action in a vacuum, so to speak. And then rule utilitarianism is where you have a set of rules, go figure. And that set of rules will maximize utility if followed. So you don't evaluate each action in a vacuum. You evaluate it by how does it fit in with this set of rules. So if I'm going to give me an example. If I'm going to frame the innocent man to stop the race riots, which is a classic example here. If I'm going to frame the innocent man to stop the race riots, then by act utilitarianism, yeah, go for it. By rule utilitarianism, don't go for it, because if you're constantly framing innocent people, things are going to go badly in the long run.
Yeah, or like the hospital example from earlier, you think, okay, so in any given case, maybe the surgeon gets away with it. But if this happened a lot,
people start going into the hospital and not coming out, and nobody knows. People are going to stop going to the hospital, and eventually this is going to lead to long-term disaster, even though it might lead to short-term utility maximization.
Yeah, exactly. So if you know that if you go into the hospital, you're perfectly healthy, there's even like a 5% danger that you're going to be cut up for organ harvesting. You're not going to. I mean, first of all, we've just abolished the practice of checkups. That's just not going to happen at that point. Like, you have to be really worried you're about to die to go to a hospital, and ultimately there's going to be less utility than if you just didn't do this at all. And so the rule utilitarian says that you should maximize, that you should follow the rule that, if generally followed, will maximize happiness, rather than doing the action which in any given case will maximize happiness. And I see some questions in the chat about how this might be similar or different to like what Rawls thinks or what Kant thinks, Kant's categorical imperative.
I mean, in both cases, you've got rules.
Yeah.
The way you determine those rules is going to be different.
Yeah. So the real quick and dirty explanation of
I like it when you talk like that.
Yeah. So the question is of the difference between rule utilitarianism.
This was wholesome until
about
30 seconds ago.
Right? Is that the difference between rule utilitarianism and deontology, which is the view that there are certain moral rules.
You have certain duties.
So that you should do whatever your moral duty defined by these rules is, with no reference to consequences. The difference between that and rule utilitarianism is that if you're Kant or Rawls or Scanlon or somebody else with a non-consequentialist idea of how you figure out what the rules are, then you're not worried about whether the rules are going to lead to more happiness. You're justifying the rules in some other way besides whether they have good consequences or not. If you know just a little bit about Kant, you might think, well, hold on, that kind of sounds like Kant is talking about consequences.
That's because you only know a little bit about Kant.
So if you want to know a lot about Kant, the episode dropping next Thursday for patrons.
He has something going on.
The Beginner's Guide to Kant with Russell Sabriglia, Ryan Lake, and Matt McManus will help disabuse you of this. But also, you're in really good company because Jon Stewart Mill, who was a really brilliant and interesting philosopher, misinterpreted Kant in exactly this way in the introduction to his book Utilitarianism.
Yes, the chat's been dirty for a while.
Fair enough.
King
but,
Tut.
That's the chat, as David Feldman always tells me, they're animals in the chat, So anyway, those are going to be a little bit different. So some of these you can solve with rule utilitarianism. Maybe that parfait thing we said, the Soylent Green one, the repugnant consequence. Maybe you can solve that by switching from talking about maximizing good consequences to average good consequences. Maybe there's also another way of objecting to utilitarianism, which is that you could object not to the consequentialism part, but to the hedonism part. Remember, hedonism is the view that the only thing that's good in itself is happiness, so everything else gives way to that. That's the ultimate value.
And the way that we came up, well, not we, but the way that the utilitarian came up with this is Bentham wanted a theory that was, morality is by humans and for humans, according to him. So he wanted a theory that was based in human nature. And he says, what is human nature? What is it that human beings are driven by? And he said the only thing that drives humans is the desire for pleasure and the desire to avoid pain. So if humans, morality, human nature, pleasure, pain, that's got to be what morality is about. Let's go.
Yeah. So but
I think you might have skipped over one that we should talk about now. Is that an objection to rule utilitarianism is that it just collapses into act utilitarianism because there's no hard and fast set of rules. So, and for some reason, every class that I heard this in as an undergrad or whatever, it was Rule 37. It was always Rule 37. Suppose Rule 37 is, and then it gives you a rule that sounds good, like don't frame innocent people.
Yeah.
But what if you then came up with 37 star, which is don't frame innocent people unless it's to stop a race riot. So you can if you tweak the rules, then you're eventually just going to end up with yes, good place, yes. If you start tweaking the rules, and why can't you? You're eventually just going to end up with a rule for every situation, which is act utilitarianism all over again.
Yeah. So right, that does seem like a big problem. And I think one different way of getting at that is to think like any given situation, any action, like can be described by different general rules. So even like extreme cases like that hospital one, like, okay, well, one general rule is don't kill innocent people. That sounds good. And surely one that will in most cases lead to, to more happiness and less suffering. But another general moral rule that also sounds pretty good is when possible, save innocent people's lives. And this is a case where those two come into conflict. So how do you decide which one wins? And if the answer is the way that the tiebreaker is, well, which one is going to cause more happiness or suffering in this situation, then you're just back to act utilitarianism. It's the same thing again. So that's a big problem. Another big problem. Most of these problems we've been talking about are problems with consequentialism in general. The idea that what's morally good is whatever has the best consequences. Things are morally bad to the extent they have bad consequences. But the other way of attacking at least classic utilitarianism is by attacking hedonism.
You said that.
Yeah, but then I got off track and I said it again.
Sorry, I took you off track.
It happens. That's okay. All right. Yeah.
That's our life.
It's not unprecedented. Anybody who watches this has seen this before.
With us?
Not with us.
Oh, no. Anybody who knows us has seen this before.
Yeah, but also anybody who watches this is probably.
Oh, sure. You don't need me to get off track.
Seen me get off track and then repeat myself because I'm trying to remember what I was saying before.
It's basically how you are in life.
Yeah, fair enough. So.
Y'all need any inside baseball about him?
Sure.
I'm your girl.
Sure. So, so the point. So one way of attacking hedonism, this claim that morality is the absolute, that happiness is the ultimate moral value, is by thinking about the way that, like people like Mill will often argue for hedonism, which is, this is a paraphrase, I think it's an okay paraphrase to say, well, the hedonist can essentially say, hey, you're a hedonist too, you just don't realize it, because everything that you value because you think it leads to more happiness and less suffering. If you think that you value something for some other reason, that's just because you're like, there's some intermediate value that you're latching onto, and really the only reason you value that is, more happiness, less suffering. So let's just be serious here and admit that the only thing that anybody values is happiness. The only thing anybody disvalues is suffering. And clearly nobody really believes that anything else is valuable.
Why do you do anything that you do? Because in the end, even if you have to go a few steps, it makes you happy.
Yeah, exactly. And so this,
or it relieves.
Right.
Makes you less unhappy than other courses of action.
Right. But there is this really interesting objection to that that comes from Robert Nozick, who believes many terrible things about political philosophy as a libertarian, but was when he was writing his classic work. I think he later rethought some of that. But he has this really interesting argument against utilitarianism, specifically against hedonism, which is this example, this thought experiment, the experience machine.
Before we do that, there's a couple of things people are saying over here, bringing up psychological egoism, which is the idea that that's why we do everything we do, because it is going to bring us happiness in the end. And the way you can get around that is that that's not why we do everything we do. It's why we do some things that we do. It doesn't drive everything. If happiness comes along with it, then that's one thing, but it may not always be the goal. It may just be a side effect.
Yeah. So
if I give to charity,
yeah,
it's going to make me happy, but that's not why I did it. I did it because other people are in need or whatever reason I might have for doing it. And the fact that it makes me happy, that comes along with it, but that wasn't what I was aiming for by doing it.
Yeah. So if helping people makes you happy, it's not quite right to say that all that's really motivating you is being happy, because
that wasn't your motivation for doing it. It's just
because it wouldn't make you happy unless you cared about that. The reason it makes you happy is because you care about that. Otherwise, like if the suffering of other people made you happy, it's a separate. So psychological egoism is the idea that we're only ever motivated by our own happiness, but that's a little bit different from hedonism, because the hedonist can admit that we're not always motivated by our personal happiness, that sometimes we behave altruistically. We care about lots of things that are outside of ourselves. The hedonist is making a narrower claim, which is a more modest claim, which is that all of the things we care about are in some way about happiness, even if not necessarily our own happiness. That, like when you're helping people, you're doing that because you care about whether they're happy. If you're trying to, if you're dying in like some war over some political cause, you're doing that because you think, even knowingly sacrificing yourself. So it's clearly not about your own happiness. That's because you think that cause will generate, more happiness or something like that, right?
I was telling Ben, when was this, yesterday, that I would push him out of the way of an oncoming truck, even if I was then in the way of the oncoming truck. And that certainly isn't because it would make me happy, but I would do it anyway.
I would push you out of the way, and I'm a lot bigger, so I think I would win.
There are self-defeating actions, obviously, but that's just a mistaken idea of what's going to be best for you in the end.
Yeah. So
we're not always wise.
Sure. Absolutely, right. But the hedonist can accommodate.
I've just somebody brought that up, and
right. But that's that's not going to bother the hedonist, because they're going to say, sure, you're just wrong about what's going to generate happiness.
Yeah.
So in any case, so this thought experiment, the experience machine, it's about. How would we describe this? How would you set this up?
It's a machine, and it gives you experiences.
That was very helpful.
No, the idea is that you go into the experience machine place, and you write down all of the things that you would do in your life were that possible. You want to climb Mount Everest, you want to visit Australia, you want to marry Rafael Nadal, you want to win Wimbledon, whatever. You write down all the things that you want to do that are not going to be possible for you to do. And they hook you up, and you say, yes, this is a life I want to live. And they hook you up, and from then it's like you're dreaming. It's a really realistic dream. And to you are experiencing all of these things. You are climbing Mount Everest, and you are marrying Rafael Nadal, and all these things that you wanted.
Yeah.
But your real life is like lying, like in the Matrix, how he's lying there and he's all slimy and he's hooked up with it. That's your real life. But to you, your experiences are all these wonderful things.
Yeah.
Dude, I want to go to Singapore.
Well, I think he was giving this as an example of the experience machine.
Yes, I would definitely have that in my experience machine.
And so you try to imagine this. Okay, would you do this? And if you're thinking, okay, well, I wouldn't do this because I would know that it wasn't real.
No, you don't know.
Yeah. So like one way to set it.
As soon as they hook you up, you don't know. You think this is really the life that you're living.
Yeah. You can imagine that it's
Rafa's left bicep.
you imagine that like somebody, I mean, we could just make do the quick dumb example where somebody is somebody tells you about the experience machine, they give you the choice, like the Matrix, red pill or blue pill, do you want to go into the experience machine or not? You have 10 minutes.
And it's a lifelong choice.
You have 10 minutes.
It's not like the dude that goes back into the Matrix. You don't get to undo your choice.
Yeah. Joe Minton, I always love it when people ask this question and talk about the experience machine. How do we know that's happening now? Subject, perhaps, of a different stream. What about epistemology? But a good setup for it. So then they could say, okay, like you hear about it, and like within 15 minutes of hearing about it, let's say you have to make your choice, and then the first thing the experience machine does is it erases your memory of the last 15 minutes and then sets up some plausible plot line that would get you from whatever you were doing just before you heard about the experience machine to having all these wonderful experiences for the rest of your life.
I'm in the Michigan backwoods, and all of a sudden I'm married to Rafa. And his left bicep.
Don't like that. All right. So
that would not be happening in your experience machine.
So in any case, and what Nozick thinks that this shows, or like some of the way he presents this is a little unclear, but like I think one way of understanding what he thinks this shows is that hey, here's at least one thing that we value other than happiness. We value connection to objective reality. And so, because after all, if you don't want to go into the experience machine, because
what does that show? Because
it wouldn't be real. Well,
we value reality. And yes, we did meet in grad school, and I'm from Texas.
Yes. Thank you for that. That was a lot of fun last night. So I went on the Surfs show, and they did this thing where they made people say whether they were going to argue for something for or against something before they knew what the subject was. So people had to argue for positions they found abhorrent, and it was so it was I felt I felt a little gross after, but it was fun doing it.
I was in the other room. I was watching Colin Cowherd, and Ben was screaming in the other room. Well, and I was like, "Oh, what is happening?"
Because I was playing this like Ben Shapiro type character, telling people that facts don't care about their feelings and whatnot.
And I was turning Colin Cowherd up louder and louder, trying to drown this out.
So the idea with because normally if you say, oh, I value connection to objective reality, which is the sort of thing that I think even outside of wacky thought experiments like this, we do value that you don't just want to believe things. The people do care about having true beliefs, even when they're not in any obvious way getting anything out of it instrumentally. That it bothers them if they believe something that turns out not to be true, even if it didn't actually hurt them to believe that thing. But normally, the philosophical hedonist would be able to explain this. They'd say, oh, no, you still agree with me. You still agree that only happiness is good in itself. But this sense of connection to external reality is, makes you happy. So that's why you value it. But in the experience machine case, that doesn't work, because it's what you're losing is connection to external reality, not a sense of connection to external reality. You would feel just as real to you as your normal day-to-day life does before you go in the experience machine. And I think it's also worth saying, just to really drive home the point, that you might think, okay, well, if I was going to have a fantastic pseudo life in the experience machine,
nothing could be better than life with me. Come on.
and my life was just going to be miserable outside of it, maybe I would go in, right? Maybe you could come up with some circumstances in which you'd be so your circumstances would be so miserable that, or your circumstances in the experience machine would be so amazing that you'd be willing to go in. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have the reaction that Nozick wants you to have, because the real question is, okay, would it be just a given? Like, you wouldn't even have to think about it. Yeah, of course I'd do that.
Somebody there was like, yeah, I go, no questions asked, but would you?
Yeah.
I mean, that might be your your intuition, but then once you started thinking about it,
yeah.
are you really so quick to say yeah?
And what if you're, and we can maybe make that clearer by messing with the example a little bit. So what if your experiences in the experience machine were only going to be like 2% better than your experiences in real life? Would you really go in then? And I think even a lot of people who might be tempted, if they thought there was going to be a big gap, yeah, no, of course, yeah, I wouldn't do that, right? Or really to really show, well, if you're, what if your life in the experience machine was going to be no worse, but also no better than your real life? Well, technically speaking, if all you cared about was happiness, or at least your own happiness, then that would just be a coin flip. It would just be a matter of indifference to you, whether you went in or not. But I have a hard time believing that there's anybody for whom it would really genuinely be a coin flip, whether to go into the experience machine where their experiences would be no better, or to stay connected to reality. Which...
Now, hang on. This person there, that they're being like a student right there. You have to assume that you're going to get what you were promised.
Yeah.
Otherwise, this doesn't work.
Yeah. I mean, the question.
Yeah, when you deal with a thought experiment, you have to assume that it's going to go. You know, my students are always like, "But what if this?" And no, you can't do that.
Yeah, don't.
That defeats the purpose of what we're talking about.
Yeah, don't lawyer this. This is
that's what he always tells me. Stop lawyering this.
Yeah, see, this goes back to what we were saying before.
It may be a practical consideration, but we're not trying to be practical. We're trying to. The whole point of thought experiments is to figure out the principle that you're using to answer something that's supposed to be, and isn't always, but it's supposed to be a pretty obvious question. You know, would you get in the experience machine? It's supposed to be pretty obvious that the answer is no. What principle are you using to get there? And then you take that principle and you have to apply it. If you want to be consistent, you have to apply that same principle. And heroin, that's not a good idea. You know, you know, I watched Breaking Bad. I saw what's his face, the younger cute one,
Jesse.
Yeah, Jesse. But yeah, you don't want to be on heroin because the in-betweens are so don't do it.
So heroin isn't as good as the experience machine. You heard it here first. But
yeah, the experience machine is like straight heroin. I mean, okay, you could do that for your experience machine. Right. You could be like, I want to be on heroin,
but you wouldn't have the crashes and the parts in between.
Yeah, you would. It would just be like,
that, right?
Yeah, heroin all the time.
Yeah,
you could.
So
you could have that.
So the and you say, okay, well, maybe in reality you could never be sure, but the point it's like a word problem that's in like a math or science class.
Why do you need 37 watermelons?
I don't know. You're trying to.
Nobody over there said that was from what you said. You said math problem, which automatically brings up 37 watermelons.
Oh, okay. So
right, Kathy.
So but like in like a word problem, the point is that you're just trying to isolate like the factors that you want to look at. It's the same thing here. You're trying to isolate certain factors. So it's like, okay, look, maybe in anything that really happened that was basically like this, you couldn't be sure that you were going to get what you're promised. But assume for the sake of argument that you could somehow be sure you were going to get what you promised. Then would you go in, yes or no? That's the question. And if you still say no, that suggests, or even if you're torn, right? Even if you might ultimately say yes, if you're still torn about it, that suggests that you do actually value at least one thing other than happiness. And of course, it could be that you don't want to go to the experience machine because other people, you know, are going to miss you or something like that. But then you say, okay, well, would you want everybody in the world to simultaneously go into the experience machine so there's no worry about like how it's going to affect other people? And if you'd still say no, you'd still find that horrifying, right? You know, you'd be on Keanu's side of the Matrix. You'd want people to wake up and disconnect from it.
Can I marry Keanu in the?
I don't like this line of questioning.
And you are still thinking about it too much. Forget about your neurons.
So,
jeez.
So that suggests if you would hesitate at all, right? If it wouldn't just be like in the version where the experience machine was no better or no worse than the experiences you'd have in real life, that wouldn't be a coin toss to you. That suggests that you do value at least one thing other than positive experiences. You do disvalue at least one thing other than negative experiences. And if so, then that really takes away like the big argument for hedonism, which is, come on, what are we talking about? We're all hedonists. Nobody really values anything ultimately except for happiness or not. And that opens the door to other things being valuable. And it's something that's also that's, and especially in combination with some of the other objections to utilitarianism that are targeted in consequentialism, which suggest that there might be other things that are even specifically morally valuable besides happiness or avoidance of of pain. That if you think that if you're not convinced, like this is another, I'm losing the name of the article, but I think it's Bernard Williams, Utilitarianism and Integrity, where with the example about the villagers we talked about earlier, and like another of his examples is like a young chemist who's this is probably written like during the Vietnam War, and he's considering taking a job at some company that manufactures chemical weapons that would be used to inflict horrible pain and death on people, in some war that's going on. If you think, oh, if I didn't take the job, somebody else would. If you don't think that that's a good enough excuse to take it, you think it would still be morally bad for him to take it anyway, that suggests that even morally you care about something other than good and bad consequences.
Also, if God shows up and wants your starship, I suggest you give it to him.
Yeah, that's a since I'm an old man, I know what he's talking about. I
have no idea what he's talking about.
That's Star Trek 5, I want to say. Nope. One of those. Anyway, this first one, second one is the
he's such a dork.
Okay, I'm going to stop trying to remember Star Trek movies. Anyway, that's one of them. There's a whole thing with there's like an entity claiming to be God who's...
I'm sure I knew it was some sort of reference, and that guy wasn't just like...
he wasn't just wondering what happens if God shows up and wants your stars.
Star Trek 5.
Star Trek 5. There we go. Okay.
You're a lovely dork. I agree.
Aww.
You're the loveliest dork. I know. I married him. I knew he was a dork when I married him.
Wasn't a secret. What were we talking about?
I have no idea.
Okay, so all of this might give you some reason to think that there are other things that are valuable, maybe even other things that are morally valuable, besides good and bad consequences understood in terms of happiness and unhappiness. And I'd also say, just to loop back, and we'll probably end on this point unless people have super chat questions or anything like that, but we'll probably wrap it up about here and then plug stuff coming up. But that even in terms of what we were talking about earlier, like why utilitarianism might seem appealing, that there are also, even if it does capture certain like intuitions behind like generally socially progressive ideas about what could count as moral or immoral, things like that, there are other things that it really doesn't capture. So that might also, without going too deep into the politics, that we might think like that example about a riot that could be prevented by framing an innocent person. That we think, okay, if the point, we don't want to have like a harsh and punitive justice system that's all about like making people suffer, but we might still think that whether you that we don't just care about good and bad consequences, we also care about like whether you're innocent or you really did it, which is what that example about framing somebody to prevent a riot brings out. And you might even think there are real life examples that.
What if you accidentally frame the right person?
Yeah, it's like a little moral Gettier case.
Let's not bring that up.
So there is actually a video that's floating around of us talking about the Gettier problem.
There
that's
is.
For
it's a great video.
Epistemology. Maybe we'll put the link in the description. But
we used to teach together all the time.
Yeah, Rutgers. Yep.
Yeah. So our classes were arranged so that we could often go into each other's and co-teach. It was a lot of fun.
Yep.
Students seemed to tolerate it pretty well.
I think they were entertained by it.
They were always glad to see me. Ben's students be like, "Oh, Jen's here." What a relief.
And there was the and Lucy would come a lot of times too. They were pretty relaxed about that at Rutgers. So, which actually she's surprisingly well behaved. She just sort of run around saying hi to everybody and then just settle in a corner of the room. But you might.
I miss Rutgers.
Yeah, so the utilitarian, to answer the question in the chat, the utilitarian would say the innocence doesn't matter given the greater utility. But if you disagree with the utilitarian, you think, no, it's wrong to frame innocent people, even if it brings about good consequences, then that gives you a reason to think that maybe utilitarianism isn't the right moral theory.
Gettier problems are not boring, and neither are we.
There we go. Especially not getting your problems. Come on.
But, I'm not boring. I don't know about you.
No, neither of those things are boring.
Yeah,
but
I agree.
But in any case, then so you might even think there are like real life versions of the same kind of thing. So like if you think about people who defend the death penalty and sometimes want there to be like limited appeals, because if people are just, spending decades filing appeals or whatever before they're executed, then it won't have this effect of deterring crime because people won't, it won't have this immediate consequence.
Because that's how people want to spend their lives, sitting in jail, filing appeals for decades.
Appreciate that, Yoda 7104. Appreciate the super chat. But if you think that that's like a repulsive view, you think, no, even if you didn't oppose the death penalty outright, which you should, but even if you don't, right, you think, no, that's ridiculous. You certainly don't want to execute somebody you're not super duper sure is guilty. Then that again seems to be a non-consequentialist intuition about this. Or like if you think about people like sending, like the government, like sending drones to assassinate suspected terrorists, while they're sitting outside like coffee shops in Yemen or whatever. If you think that that's really bad and wrong and unjust,
political.
But if you think, you might think, and like your Noam Chomsky's and Glenn Greenwald's and whatnot would certainly argue this, that it doesn't actually lead to less terrorism, that it's counterproductive anyway. But that might, even if you agree with that, that's probably not your only reason for having a problem with that. It's like you probably don't think, okay, well, if the math worked out, then we could send flying killer robots to drop bombs on people sitting outside cafes who somebody suspected might be a terrorist. You might think, no, it would still be wrong, even if the utiles and what were we going to call the anti-utiles?
Dolores,
the utiles and the Dolores worked out the right way. That again would give you a reason to not be a utilitarian. And I guess maybe like we could end here. Could say, just to tease the Beginner's Guide to Kant dropping for patrons next week.
That's your business. I won't be there.
Yeah, you want to?
Too many people.
Okay, so if you. Sam Harris does things like that. Remember, one of the things you learn from the stream is Aristotle better than Sam Harris. So,
I was supposed to write that down.
Yeah. Make sure we don't forget. They have. So the way a lot of these examples that we've talked about, what like the chemist working for, helping enable war crimes by working for the company that was making napalm or whatever, or the person visiting the country where people were going to be massacred in the village square, or the surgeon cutting up the innocent person to harvest their organs. The first two are Bernard Williams. The last one is Judith Jarvis Thompson. But in all of those sorts of examples, you think, okay, well, if you think those things are wrong, even though they would lead to more happiness and less suffering than not doing them, then you need some non-utilitarian theory of what makes things morally wrong. And so Kant's non-utilitarian moral theory, and this is just going to be like a 30-second version of Kant, again, doing a whole episode about it next week. But the 30-second version of why Kant would say those things are morally wrong is that he doesn't think that morality is about good and bad consequences. He thinks that morality is about following the categorical imperative, and there are a couple of different versions of this, but one of them that's maybe easiest to wrap your mind around says that it's wrong to treat other people as merely means to your ends.
Don't use people.
Yeah. So if, it's not wrong to treat people as means to your ends, because that would be a totally lunatic view that would mean it was wrong to ask a friend to help you move a couch.
Are you teasing this, or are you doing it now?
But it's wrong to use people merely as means to an end. We will talk about that more in the episode for patrons next Thursday. But just to apply it to these examples to see how these things relate to each other, if you're
the axe murder at the door, I'm sure they'll.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
I do that for my students. I use these little stuffed animals of Snoopy and Woodstock, and Snoopy's always the murderer at the door. Yeah. Also, I think Aristotle would have a very boring podcast, because Aristotle's writing, he never wrote a book. Those are just his class notes put together by his students. So you can imagine what sitting through class with Aristotle would be. And if he was just doing a podcast, it would just be a monologue with no students there to ask questions, or, maybe we see a spider going by and be like, oh, look, a spider, and somebody would have to go kill, no interruptions, just Aristotle. Yeah. I don't think we want to listen to that.
Yeah. Plus it being Greek.
There is that problem, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe Ryan Lake, he could translate it for us. He's been working on his Greek on Duolingo.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah. So if you had, the surgeon cutting the guy up is clearly treating him as if he wasn't morally significant in himself, as if he were just a means to this end, which is a great end. It's a really good end, which saving lots of innocent people, the 5 innocent people who each need transplants or whatever. One needs a heart, one needs a liver, they have, so it's a great end, but you're still not allowed to reduce a person to merely a means to an end, would be Kant's explanation of what's wrong with that.
But here people bring up, well, how do you know that all the organ transplants are going to take? Because not all organ transplants take. So you don't do that stuff.
Just yes.
Don't do that stuff.
Again, this takes us back to.
I'm sorry. I've loved your commentary the whole way. I'm not trying to.
This takes us.
I'm not trying to pick on you.
Yeah. Who are you talking to right now?
This person.
LaRose Blanche in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay. So.
I don't want to call anybody out.
Well, I mean, everybody can see that it's okay.
Well, I know
it's okay. I don't think they feel called out.
Okay. I've very much enjoyed reading your stuff.
Yeah. So, assume that this is the most amazing transplant surgeon ever. That somehow or another he knows that they'll all take. Again, not the point.
Not the point.
Don't we said earlier that in the hierarchy of the wretchedness of the professional managerial class, the lawyers are very far down, so don't be like that. So anyway, and Kant would presumably say similar things about all those other examples, that if you have...
Kant doesn't like it when you kill people.
Yeah, unlike most people who think that's awesome, but yeah. But Kant's explanation of why it's bad that you kill people is that, or at least that you kill people in circumstances like what we're talking about. It might be okay in self-defense or something, but it's the thing that's wrong with killing people in order to do things like harvest their organs, or because you just need a job, and so you take the job at Dow Chemical making napalm or whatever, is that you're treating your victims as merely a means to an end. And lots of other options besides utilitarianism and Kantianism, but we've been going for an hour and a half. So
Tony, yes, he did.
Oh.
And you were not boring. I'm sure we will talk about the veil of ignorance.
Yeah. We will
we'll hit that too.
We will for sure do a Rawls one at some point. And for sure do a
Nathaniel, no.
Epistemology. Yeah. Kant definitely doesn't think that. Maybe we'll get into that in the thing next week. But in any case,
so Nathaniel, he said you could not use humanity in oneself or in others.
Yeah.
So whatever, you can't use other people solely as a means. Neither can you. We're not going to talk about Thales. Neither can you use yourself solely as a means.
Yeah. Might talk about Thales someday. Who knows? But
sure.
Why not?
Thales is greater than everybody. Did you see that pass through before?
Oh yeah.
So maybe we should.
I did. Is he the one who fell into the ditch?
No, he was the one that thought everything was water.
Yeah, I remember that. But
I don't think he's the one that fell into. I could be wrong, but
okay. All right. Well, we'll look that up. If we ever talk about Thales, we'll look up to see if he's the guy who fell in the ditch or not. But in any case, so we are going to cut it there for today. So
I hope you haven't minded having me around.
I think people liked it. I cannot imagine that they would not have. So again, want to hear more about Kant? If you're a patron, you get that episode next Thursday. And meanwhile, if for some bizarre reason you don't want to hear more about Kant, then or you just can't swing that, whatever, then stuff coming up before that. And other than that, on Monday, we are going to have Matt McManus, Marion Trejo, and Conrad Hamilton in because Jordan Peterson's new book, 12 More Rules, is dropping, and they all co-wrote with me this book, Myth and Mayhem, leftist response to Jordan Peterson. So that's coming up on Monday. Also, since David Griscom is still on vacation and he can't do the usual music segment, Vic Viana is going to come on to do some rock punditry at the end.
This is why I never see
you. Talk about Pink Floyd. And next Wednesday for the movie stream, we're going to be talking about Scanner Darkly. And next Friday for this, we'll be talking about some philosophy subject, TBA.
Yeah, so, we haven't talked about that yet.
Fair enough.
We'll figure it out Friday morning.
So thanks to everybody who stuck with us for this and asked questions in the chat, gave the super chats, much appreciated. And we'll see a lot of you presumably on Sunday for the debate stream. The Taibbi versus Esco viewing on Herbert Marcuse. Then for the regular episode on Monday at 7:30. Appreciate all of you guys very, very much. Left is best.